Okay, it's sometimes said that everything in Unix is a file. I made this comment before. It's a little bit overstated, but the idea is that a tremendous number of things, like the keyboard, information from tape drives, information from the network, these are all treated as files in Linux. And in fact, if you go look in the /dev folder, you'll find all these different devices that you can in principle get access to. So CD-ROMs, disks for sure, but DVDs, and you'll also find network information, for example, or ports on the computer, I/O information, input-output ports. So there's a tremendous amount of things mapped, being treated as files that you can access through a regular interface as a file. And every open file that is open is given what's called a file descriptor, which is a small input. It can be used, it's a so-called handle, it can be used to access the information of the file from a command, so within a command. So if you write a C program, it can get access to what files are being manipulated, and it's using these descriptors behind the scenes. Okay. 3 of these are associated with every process that runs. So when we run a command, it automatically has access to the standard input, to the standard output, and to standard error. We talked about those last time. Standard input is where it gets its information from. Maybe it's from a pipe. Maybe it's typed in on the keyboard by the user. Maybe it's from a different file that's redirected into it. Standard output is where it puts most of its output, and standard error is where it puts warning messages, error messages, and so on. And in C programs, you can get access to these, the so-called stdin, stdout, and stderr. And you don't have to open them as a file. You can simply say, for example, print to this file, or do an fprintf and put it out to one of these, to stdout or stderr. In C++, these things are manifested as cin, cout, and cerr. Did you see those things last year? Yeah? Okay. So you would put things out to cout, for example, or put things out to cerr to report, for example, errors or urgent things, or to report regular output. So these just refer to stdin, stdout, and stderr, and sometimes they're coming from a file, sometimes they're coming from a pipe, and sometimes they're coming from user input. It doesn't care. They're all coming in via stdin, for example. So just to emphasize this point, because I haven't really used this much, you'll notice that while we've done a lot of these outputs to files or piping, we haven't done input much. Just to emphasize this, I could say, cat foobar, for example, as a file, but I could also say cat foobar like that. This is functionally doing the same thing, but here, this could be any number of different things here. In this case, it's saying take your input from here and put it as your standard input. Here it's saying, okay, go open this file and treat that as standard input. Here it's kind of taking all the input and passing it, actually line by line, to this for it to execute. Here it's we're being explicit about it opening the file. So this is a way of specifying stdin as coming from a file. If we wanted to put it to the output from this to a file, of course, we do greater than bar. Does that make sense? Okay, people comfortable with that? So we've seen, outputs to things, we've seen inputs from things. So this takes the std out and puts it to a file. This takes stdin from a file, and we've seen how we can also use pipes to put it out to a different command. So stdin is actually file descriptor 0. And by default, it goes to the keyboard if it's not coming from somewhere else. Stdout is file descriptor 1. You don't have to really worry about this terribly much, which its number is, but you should realize these are built in. You automatically have access to them from C or C++. And by default, this goes out to a terminal or to some of this display. As you can see, you can put it to any number of different other Unix commands, by piping, for example, or put it out to a file. And finally, stderr, file descriptor 2, and it's by default it's used for errors. Some programs don't adhere to this convention. It's a good convention. If you have an error, don't just put it out among your normal output, or it can get lost. Put it out somewhere else. So, for example, if I were doing something like this, ls foo, so I'm going to do ls take a look at all foos, and then I'll also tell it something that doesn't exist. I don't exist. Okay. Or non-file. I'll just say. Okay. There's no file called that. Okay. If I put that into a file called bar, okay, you'll notice that it puts out a message here. Will bar have some contents here? Yeah, it has the standard out from that. So it put its standard out to bar. Why did it put this thing out to me like this? Yeah, that's its what? It's standard error. So it had regular output, but this message was not mixed in with it. This message was actually to stderr. Now that's not obvious if you just execute it like this. It's just one thing after the other. But if you actually tell it, hey, put your standard output to this file, it's obvious. Okay, this is going to a different place, right? Now I could tell it to put this other output into, for example, to a different folder. For example, I could tell it put it to Baz, and it can actually take this output out and put it to a place which is also stored away, but it's separated from it. It's separate information, a separate stream. Okay, so here we had seen this to file going for redirection of stderr. So here I have output from stderr going to Baz, output from stodout going to bar. Okay, and they're not mixed together. Okay, I think I'll stop there for today. I know people have this lab right afterwards. Are there any final questions coming out of the lab that I can highlight right now in the closing 2 minutes for anyone that's wondering about something before the lab? Before finishing. Questions? Residual questions? Yes. Yes? The dot, or you use the absolute. Yeah, true. To move the file at the very beginning of the lab, thanks for the question. At the very beginning of the lab, you're asked to move a file from the Mac side, where you presumably downloaded it from Google, to the TuxWorld side. And you have a couple options here, folks. You can do that with SCP, secure copy, and you'll actually be described within the lab. The lab TA will explain how that can work, and that's a perfectly good option. Copies it from this machine to another machine. Another way you can do it is by doing a command copy a file. You should know what that command is. And you can take it from your current location and put it over to Mac home. We saw how that was done today, right? And you can do that using absolute syntax. Copy it from here to this other place that's /student/ whatever. Or you can do it in relative syntax. Copy it from here to this other place, /student/ Mac home, whatever. Okay? So you have 3 ways of doing that you should be comfortable with. Okay? To get that file from your Mac over to the TuxWorld machine. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry? My videos are on a link, can be found through a link that's on the Moodle site right now, and they're in playlists on my YouTube account. But there's a link to it from Moodle. Okay? Let me know if you can't find it.
I'm just curious, what would be the difference between these two?
Yeah. So if there's a single thing in here, nothing. But if there's a you could have A, B, C, or you could have any number of different things within these brackets, and that would allow several options rather than here where you're limited to a single character. So that, yeah, just B by itself is kind of not really using this to its benefit. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, this gets much more interesting if it's LS, foo, you know, A, B, or C, or something like that. In which case, it could be any of these.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was a little confused because you were searching foo bar.
Yes.
Foo bars. You
Yeah.
put BA, so I thought it was BA, and then.
Oh.
Okay.
Got it. Okay, I'll try to clarify
Another
that.
question was.
Yeah. So
in
it's
terms of
either of these.
okay, when you were searching head and tail,
Yes.
to add extra lines that just shows like top 3 lines or the lines, four lines.
Right.
Is there any function that shows like if you wanted to show just lines 3 through 5 or something like that?
Well, you could do tail of a head, or head of a tail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Then just because
I'm not aware of any other